So this is an overview of the first half of chapter 22, which really begins with what influenced Charles Darwin to come up with the thought process or the idea of natural selection. And there were actually quite a few scientists that the textbook talks about and puts heavy emphasis on. And if you're looking at the slide from the PowerPoint for chapter 22, there's actually one other scientist that's in here that is not listed on their timeline, and that's Carolus Linnaeus, who was in the just prior to Hutton. And Carolus Linnaeus was very important, not so much in influences to Darwin, but as to the learning about evolution and how organisms are grouped together. So Carolus Linnaeus is really called the father of classification. So he created the categories, the animal, plant, fungus, that organisms are placed under. And he started categorizing them and created the genus and species component of how things are categorized. And it's only been in the last 10 or 15 odd years that a lot of the organisms that had been placed in a specific kingdom have been shifted because we've learned a lot more about DNA. But again, just before Hutton, we have Carolus Linnaeus, who is responsible for really starting to classify organisms and look at what kind of a category they should be in. And then we have Hutton, whose thought was that things have changed over a time period, and he was a geologist who looked at layers or strata of the earth and said that you can see by looking at extinctions in the different geological strata, and we know that we've gone through several mass extinctions, that change happens naturally on the planet gradually. And that has been disputed. There are at times organisms that do change gradually, but we also have quite a bit of proof that evolution can happen in just a few short generations. And then we have Malthus, who is the mathematician. And he had all kinds of mathematical ideas of how populations changed. And again, he created an essay on how populations mathematically could change very quickly. And Darwin, we know, did read his work. But again, it's just one of those like bricks that are laid on the sidewalk that got Darwin to his eventual thought. Hutton, that said change happened gradually. Malthus, who was a mathematician, who said that we can measure populations and changes in the principle of the population. And then strangely, just in the same time period that we have Darwin being born, we have Lamarck publishing his thoughts on evolution. And he had kind of a few very interesting thoughts. And he actually came up with what was called use or disuse. So he had the idea of a vestigial organ before modern times, where if you didn't need the appendix, then the appendix is eventually going to go away. The you lose it thought. He also came up with a theory that was widely accepted for about 3 decades, and that was inheritance of acquired characteristics. And again, this is something Darwin looked at, but thankfully Darwin dismissed this quite quickly. So according to Lamarck's thought, the acquired characteristics, the textbook talks about the giraffe, and it's actually an outstanding example. In this case, if giraffes in Africa were going through hardship where there was a drought and a lot of plant life died, then the giraffes that had the longest necks were the ones that were able to reach the highest food and had the better chance of survival. And Lamarck is correct on that. But his thought was that if you had acquired that trait, if your neck kept getting longer and longer because that's what you needed to happen to survive, then that characteristic got passed on to your child. And of course, that wasn't what happened. The giraffes that had been born with the gene for a longer neck were the ones that developed the longer neck and were able to reach the taller food and survived. And if there were only a few of that species that survived because of the harsh conditions, then their genetic traits are all that are getting passed on to their children. So Lamarck had the right thought, but the wrong concept. So again, Lamarck said that acquired characteristics got passed on to the children, and that's not correct. Make sure that you understand he's talking about during their lifetime, they acquired the ability to, like if you were a bear, track a certain species, or if you were a deer, you were able to, you acquired a natural trait of being able to find better food sources, and that got automatically passed on to your child, and that's not what happened. And then Cuvier is a paleontologist and ends up being very, very important because he collects a large warehouse full of a variety of different organisms. And the vertebrate fossils end up being a very important factor of, sending Darwin on the right path. So Cuvier is making all these extensive drawings. He has fossils of fish, of dinosaurs, of birds, etc. And he finds a lot of traits that are extremely similar, and they're called homologous traits. And if I flip to the textbook very quickly, that is actually at the end of what we're going to talk about today. That's on page 463. Where he is looking at making these extensive drawings, and he says that the whale fin has the same sort of bones, the phalanges, that are found in a person, and a whale pelvis is almost identical to the same pelvis that a person has. And then we have Lyell, and he writes about his principles of geology and how he thinks, again, where Hutton thought things were very gradually changed, and he could see that in the layers of geology. We have Lyell, who is saying that it is, again, uniform over time. And so those two principles, he can see in the fossil evidence, just as Hutton could, that we're having changes happen. And both of them are finding them to be just very natural as far as what happens on the planet, and as far as what we later find out is evolution. And then a little background on Darwin. He was kind of a strange character. Ended up going into religious, like a minister, and he marries a woman whose father is a minister. And back during that time period in England, lawyers and doctors and ministers were really considered to be a subclass of the upper class. So they were considered to be not great jobs. These were considered to be your working person, of course, better than perhaps a farmer, but not that much better as far as English society. So Darwin is not particularly wanting to work. He has a lot of hobbies. He's a very definite observer of the environment. When I was in college and I was taking a genetics class, I ended up having to take an entire course on Darwin, and we had to look at one of his books that he had published, and that was all on barnacles. He had spent a year studying barnacles, and what I did not know, and I'm still shocked at, is that barnacles have sexes and they have penises, and he would draw the penis coming out of one barnacle and going into another. But I found it very difficult for me to be so excited about a barnacle that I could spend a year observing them and making all these extensive drawings. Well, Darwin is very interesting about the world and different species, and he's invited to take a world cruise, more or less, on Her Majesty's ship, the HMS Beagle. And Darwin's stepfather really dislikes him greatly. He thinks this is a very foolish endeavor, but when he finds out that where they're going to be going, the odds were back then starvation, disease, etc. A lot of issues happen. If you're taking a cruise, a lot of people didn't come back from those expeditions. And so he pays Darwin's way really in the hope that Darwin doesn't come back. He already has his grandchildren. His daughter was married, and so he sort of thinks, now I can just dismiss the pain in my butt Darwin. So he pays for Darwin to go on the cruise. And of course, one of the big things to this, and the textbook does show at some point, if I can find the slide, I'm not going to be able to right now. He shows that Darwin ends up going off the coast of South America to the Galapagos Islands, which were really pristine. They had not seen people. There were all kinds of species. He started collecting them. He did all extensive drawings. And he really spends a good deal of his time paying attention to what they call finches. So he sort of makes the connection, which I still find amazing, that the birds he was seeing on the coast of South America and the birds that he sees on the Galapagos Islands are related. So if you go to the pet store, they still sell finches. They're rather small little birds. Sometimes they'll be called zebra finches, where they have like a gray and white stripes and a little orange beak. As a young child, pet shops sold all kinds of varieties of the finches. I had a tiny little pink and a yellow finch. But he recognizes that there's a similarity other than the beak size of the finches. And usually on the state test that the juniors won't have to take this year, but if you're a sophomore, you may have to take next year, there's a fan of pictures of the finches and all of the different beak sizes. And so Darwin starts paying a great deal of attention to the finches, and on every island, he sees a similar bird, but with different beak shapes. And so the Darwin finches are really the basis of what he writes his book on, called Descent with Modification, where he thinks that organisms sort of descended and changed due to a variety of different sources. In this case, he thought the food sources of the birds. And a lot happens between when he writes that first manuscript, The Descent with Modification, that doesn't go anywhere. And he then meets and works with Cuvier. He sees all of the fossil evidence, and it puts a light bulb off in his head. And he says, it looks like everything descended from one original species or organism. And he changes his original manuscript, Descent with Modification, to now the very famous Origin of Species, which we have in our school library. And a lot of you will probably be required to read that at some point. And the book is just so not well received. Of course, he's a minister, his father-in-law is a minister, and here he's talking about things descended from one sort of organism. So Darwin took a lot of grief over that. And then we have at the same time Wallace, who sends Darwin his hypothesis based off of Cuvier's work, that he also believes that things descended, and invites him to come see his fossil collection. And again, that put more heedance or more findings on that many species are very similar. And again, during this time period in the world, this did not go over well. So again, just as a cap of, we are looking at the different scientists, and Cuvier was your paleontologist, and Cuvier really believed that things were set. It was not evolution. It was all more that catastrophes. Things did not evolve. What happened was that there were a catastrophe and organisms were wiped out, like a flood, for example, or an earthquake. And then Lyell thought that everything changed. Lyell thought everything changed uniformly, and so he incorporated the same sort of thought as Hutton did, and they came up with uniformitism. So we've had catastrophism with Cuvier, uniformitism with Lyell and Hutton, Lamerick with the very wrong thought that we acquired the characteristics over time and they got passed on to our children. And then with the Voyage of the Beagle, we have Darwin thinking that there's an adaptation. And that was his real big thought here, is that organisms adapted. And this is a critical point for you to remember, that an organism does not evolve. It might have a mutation, but the species over time evolves. And that is really the first half of the chapter. And I will make a recording of the second half of the chapter also for you. Thank you.